All right, hello everybody. We are to the point where we are talking about Texas. So we are going to have to back up a little bit on our timeline, but you'll see why that is when we come around to things. So I'm sure that maybe one or two of you in this class are from Texas. I married a Texan, so I know all about Texas. And of course, I did go to school for a couple of these things. In fact, I went to school in Texas at a school called Sam Houston State. You should check it out. There is also a school in Texas called Stephen F. Austin. Imagine that. All these Texas heroes are getting their schools named after them. So, in any case, Stephen F. Austin is known as the father of Texas. He and his father really are the primary people who started bringing people to Texas. And the term for that is an impresario. And the Spanish and Mexican governments gave him the power to recruit Americans in particular to bring them to this area known as Texas. Really, it's the area known as East Texas, if you're familiar with Texas at all. So, the reason we say Spain and Mexico, technically this area is called Mexico, but until 1821, it belongs to Spain. But in 1821, there was a revolution and Mexico became an independent country. And there will be some fighting and different things going on for years, but it is an independent country. Spain actually had to deal with several revolutions from during basically the whole 1800s era, and the United States will get involved in more than one of them. In any case, when you were recruited, you were to become either a Spanish or Mexican citizen. You were supposed to convert to Catholicism, which was the state religion, and you were supposed to not bring slavery with you. Now, the Americans, some of them brought slavery with them anyway, and many of them did not really convert to Catholicism. And though they became citizens of Spain or Mexico, they were never fully satisfied. There was a brief period of time in the Mexican era where there was a constitution that the Americans felt was pretty good, but that actually is what causes a lot of the revolution. That Santa Anna, the leader, decides to kind of become a dictator, and typical American fashion, they don't care about that. They don't like that, and so they rebel. You might ask the question, why is Spain and Mexico bringing all these Americans in? Don't they know what they're going to do? Well, the answer is probably they didn't think about it in those terms, or they didn't think it would happen to them. And then the reality is they're having trouble getting settlers into that part of Texas because it's so far away from Mexico proper. If you just imagine the geography of the region, it is one huge desert with East Texas and kind of California being on the outer edge of that. And then you got to go into central Mexico before the desert goes away and you're into Mexico City and some of the more profitable places. So there's this huge desert. People aren't willing to go there. So recruiting Americans makes sense. So the Texas Revolution in a nutshell then is on this slide. All right. Mexico decides no more Americans. Stephen Austin tries to negotiate this and he gets thrown in jail. And of course, Texans, that's kind of the last straw. They decide that's it. And they start to rebel. And as we'll see in a minute, it's very similar to the American Revolution in many ways. So Texas will be working on a government, and they'll kind of create an army. Although it's messy, it's nowhere near as clean cut as the American Revolution was. Sometimes there were two governments, there were two armies. No one reported to anyone, and it was kind of messy. But in February and March, you can see the Texans are going to actually attack the Alamo first, and then Santa Anna is going to take a troop of soldiers. He's going to conscript soldiers and walk them through the desert. This is probably one of the reasons why it took 13 days for them to take the Alamo. The Alamo is not a fort. In fact, Sam Houston had ordered the men to leave the Alamo because it wasn't a fort. He wanted them to pull back somewhere else to an actual fort. The Alamo is a churchyard. The little bit you see if you go to San Antonio, and I highly recommend the trip because you get to go to the Alamo, and then you get to go to the Riverwalk and some other cool stuff, SeaWorld, whatever you want to do down there. But go to the Alamo. You might have done that and thought it's really small. The reality is all that's there is the church. but really it was kind of a compound with a low wall. And so some 200 men were behind those walls and they were defending themselves from the Mexican army. And they were expecting reinforcements, which never came. The one who was supposed to reinforce decided to go elsewhere, and Sam Houston never wanted them to go there in the first place. And the end result was all of the soldiers are killed, all of the volunteers are killed, the women, the children, the slaves, they're spared, and they're kind of sent back into Texas with a message that says, this is what's going to happen to you if you resist, which is what Santa Anna is famous for. When he was El Presidente for like 20 years or some long term, and whenever there would be trouble, he would just conscript an army and he would march that army into the region where there was trouble and he would smash it to pieces. And every time he did that, the Americans in Texas and the Hispanic people in Texas started going, whoa, wait a second, we don't really like that. And so you get these incidents like the Alamo, and the Alamo becomes this calling card, this rallying cry, kind of like Pearl Harbor was for the World War II generations, or 9/11 is for you. I'm sure all of you remember that. And so anyway, they're going to then have this battle at Goliad. Goliad and Gonzales are where you see the flag with the cannon on it that says, come and take it. And there's going to be a pretty bad loss there. But Sam Houston's going to kind of lead the army through Texas and up into East Texas. And he tires them out, wears them out, and he catches them off guard at a little place in the middle of nowhere called San Jacinto. And basically in about 15 minutes, the battle's over. They capture Santa Anna. And of course, what's Santa Anna going to do but negotiate for the freedom of Texas? And so because of that, Texas wins its independence. And that's the very much nutshell version of what happens. And again, as I said earlier, there are a lot of similarities between the Texas Revolution and the American Revolution, which makes sense because many of the people involved are Americans. Not all of them. There were many Mexican or Spanish people, depending on which government they held allegiance to at one time. And they were landowners and they were wealthy. And of course, the regular farmers were involved in this process. And so local Mexican-American landowners were displeased with what's going on with Santa Anna, with this new Mexican government, and how it's not following the Constitution. In fact, some of the first flags that these Texans, or Texians as they called themselves, flew were flags that represented the original Mexican Constitution. And then you add on to all of that, all of the stuff we've talked about, the threats and them taking their guns, these kind of things. The Americans are second and third generation Americans at this point. They themselves didn't fight in the American Revolution. Many of them did fight in the War of 1812, but their parents or their grandparents fought in the Revolution, and they've grown up hearing the stories about the Revolution and how great it was, and it's a huge deal. It is. And so this generation has a chance to basically recreate that. And they did. And so leaders are going to meet at this little place called Washington on the Brazos. You can see it on the map here. And that was sort of the first capital. The capital moved around a lot until it became Austin. You can see some of the battles. San Antonio is kind of fading into the black there. Then Gonzales. You can see Houston's army basically runs east. People thought Houston was a coward and all these things. Basically, Houston knew he didn't have an army ready yet, so the longer they ran, the more ready they became. And he says afterward, I was waiting for my Waterloo, which is a reference to Napoleon's defeat in the War of 1812, or the Napoleonic Wars, really. And so he found that at San Jacinto, and again, they captured Santa Anna, and the war was over. So Texas becomes an independent republic, and they will remain that way from 1836 till 1845. Sam Houston, who was the general in charge of this military effort, will be the first elected president in Texas. There was an interim president before that, and then he'll get elected again. Texas had a kind of a funny system that if you were elected president, you couldn't become president again after yourself. You had to wait, and so that's what Sam Houston did. And again, one of the many ways in which Texas is different than the rest of the country, or much of the country. So one of the reasons why you take Texas government, and you'll get all the funny particulars about that. But part of it's because of who Texans were and what they were doing. And so Sam Houston, of course, is this famous person, general, president. He'll be a governor of Texas once they become a state. He'll be a senator from Texas during that point of time. And of course, there are a lot of people that didn't survive, men and women, but names that are famous. Austin died early on in the war effort, and of course, Austin, Texas, and Colonel Travis was in charge of the regular Army personnel in the Alamo, and you have Travis County and several things. Lake Travis is named after him, and you got Davy Crockett, who's a guy from Tennessee who'd volunteered, and he and a bunch of guys came to Texas and came to the Alamo to help out. And he's an old kind of Tennessee mountain man. He'd been a senator and all this, very frustrated with kind of how some of the things in the federal government were going. And he once said, "You can all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." Well, he ended up in the Alamo, and he got killed in the Alamo. And a guy named Jim Bowie was there too. Jim Bowie was kind of a rough and tumble mountain man kind of a guy, a natural leader who never wanted to lead, but he finds himself being one of the leaders in the Alamo. He too is killed there. Juan Seguin. There are a ton of other names that come out of the Alamo that naturally figure big in Texas. So there's a picture of Sam Houston as president of Texas. Again, I went to a school called Sam Houston State, which is in Huntsville, Texas, which is named after this guy. There is a gigantic statue of him. You may have seen it if you've driven up Highway 45 from Houston, maybe up to somewhere in East Texas or up to Dallas. In any case, it's pretty up there. Lots of trees, and it's beautiful. A lot of humidity, though. But you can see on this map that there's really two parts of Texas. There's that yellowish part where you see San Antonio and Washington on the Brazos. And that's the part that everyone agrees was Texas. Today we would refer to that essentially as East Texas. If you've never been to East Texas, you should take a trip. It's really beautiful. There are trees and some mountains. It's pretty nice. But that green part is the part that Texas claims that Mexico never really agreed to. And so for the next 9 years, there will be a border dispute between Texas and Mexico. And it's over that green area. And you can see imposed behind that are the shape of the states. Of course, very few of those exist, none of the western ones. So Texas claims territory at this point that would be today in New Mexico and Colorado. And what is that, Wyoming? I think that's up there. And or is that, I don't know, it's one of those. It's been a while since I've been up there. And so there's going to be a war, basically. They're going to be in a state of conflict with Mexico this whole time. And that's one of the reasons why over these 9 years, there will be a number of attempts to get Texas to join the Union by Texas, but the United States will vote no on it. There are multiple reasons. One reason is they don't want to get in a dispute with Texas. Another reason is and the issue of slavery and balance and all of those things. This is such a humongous state. The Northerners, the non-slave people, were afraid that Texas would come in or that Texas could split up and create a whole bunch of smaller slave states. And so the answer was no. And that'll, again, last until 1844, 1845. They also have a number of Indian conflicts. The Comanche kind of run ragged in this whole western part of Texas and in this northern part of Mexico. So the Comanche are a huge, powerful group of people, tens of thousands of people, and they run wild in this whole region. Spain was never able to do anything with them. Mexico's not. Texas really isn't. The United States won't until after the Civil War, and then that'll become a real issue with the Indian Wars. And then the Sioux are kind of in the northern part of the United States and Canada also. Again, a very powerful, independent Indian tribe. So while those other tribes are being moved, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminoles are being moved to this Oklahoma region, you have these other really gigantic native tribes, and they come in contact with Texas here. And so they will achieve statehood in 1845. So 9 years, they will be their own country. Texans take a lot of pride in that. They should. But I just want to tell you that California was its own country for a few weeks, and Hawaii was its own nation for who knows how many decades before they became a state. So Texans, just remember that. Again, I married a Texan, right? So this brings us back full circle to where we left off in the previous lecture with the Log Cabin Campaign, the election of William Harrison, and how he died after 31 days because he gave this super long speech in the cold and rain, and he got sick of pneumonia and he died. So his vice president, John Tyler, becomes president. The challenge here is that's never happened before, and the Constitution is not explicit about what happens if a president dies or becomes incapacitated in some way. And so there were a lot of questions, a lot of different answers to that. Remember, we've seen political parties and different opinions on how the Constitution should be interpreted and used, and so no one quite knew what to do. Is he the president? Is he an acting president until we have another election, a special election? Are we supposed to appoint like a committee or something? And he basically says, nope, I'm the president, and kind of takes over. And everyone went, well, okay, I guess that's what it is. And he was referred to very often as His Excellency, and no one really had any kind of liking for him. He was one of those guys. One of our older textbooks refers to him as a third-rate bureaucrat who held grudges and basically didn't get along with anyone. And though he was a Whig, remember Zachary Taylor was a Whig, and then William Harrison was a Whig. This was this new party that had sort of filled the vacuum of the old Jeffersonian Republican Party, and they were an anti-Jackson party and so on. And one of the platforms was to bring back the national bank. Well, he didn't. He refused. Harrison was going to sign all this into law. John Tyler decided not to, vetoed it, and his entire cabinet quit. And eventually he gets kicked out of his party. He's the only president that I'm aware of that was kicked out of their party while they were still the president of the United States. And so obviously he will not win a re-election campaign in 1844. And he's very unpopular. John Tyler and a lot of the presidents, in fact, we're going to be talking about over the next couple of lectures, you've probably not heard of, and they're usually in the bottom 25% of presidents. You got the Roosevelts and Washington and Lincoln and Reagan up there at the top, and a few others maybe. And then you've got John Tyler and some other guys that are down at the bottom. Some because they didn't live long enough to do anything, like William Harrison. Others because they were just looked on as very weak. So we're going to get into that kind of period right now. Now, Tyler's really only claim to fame is he got the ball rolling on Texas. So that's why we did Texas here rather than at a previous point, because technically Texas begins in 1819. That's when people start moving there. But it fits really right here when it becomes a state. So you might be going around Texas and you'll see two different dates. One is Texas 1836, one is Texas 1845. And those are just 1836 when they became a nation, a republic, and 1845 is when they joined the republic that is the United States. So he gets the ball rolling on Texas, though technically Texas actually happens during James Polk and when he's president. So here's James Polk. Democrat, you can see he serves one term. James Polk may be the greatest president no one's ever heard of because he does only serve one term, which at the outset he said, I'm only going to serve one term, but he also pretty much accomplished everything he wanted to accomplish. I mean, how many presidents can say that? We all know that they make promises, but how many times do they actually accomplish what they say they're going to do? And he's referred to as Young Hickory. So you may remember our discussion about the log cabin campaign and this idea that comes about that we need a candidate who looks like Andrew Jackson, who feels like Andrew Jackson. And that's what they found. The Democrat Party missed that when they stayed with Martin Van Buren. So this time around, they figured it out. So they get their own person, and they actually called him Young Hickory. He actually is a war hero, a veteran. Again, he has all those qualifications, and he's much more like Andrew Jackson than anybody else was. And his platform's pretty simple. We're going to re-annex Texas, reoccupy the Oregon Territory, and we're going to get everything in between. And when he was done, that's what happened. Now, it might seem strange to you. He's using this prefix re, which means we're going to do something again. The reality is America's never owned Texas. But he says we're going to re-annex Texas. America does occupy the Oregon Territory already, but we're sharing it with the British. So why would he say we're going to re-annex Texas or reoccupy Oregon? Well, This speaks to an issue called manifest destiny, which is a weird term. And it really just means, and it's probably one of your key terms, it really just means that Americans had developed this idea, and it goes way back to the colonial days, and it's a leftover from their European British heritage, that they just deserve to own all the territory from east to west, right? From sea to shining sea. That inevitably, that's the idea of destiny, right? It's gonna happen. And so inevitably, America, by its virtues as this great republic and their great economic system and everything sort of about them is great. And it is, there's many great things going on here. And they just feel like it's just our destiny to own it. So when he's saying we're going to re-annex Texas, he's appealing to this idea that most Americans feel like, yeah, Texas should be ours anyway. Yeah, California should be ours anyway. Yeah, Oregon should be ours. And by the time he leaves in 1849, that's done. He's also responsible for getting tariffs lowered. For the first time in a long time, the tariffs had been brought down. He actually is overseeing the opening of the U.S. Naval Academy, the Smithsonian Institution, which is a great museum there now in Washington, and he oversaw the groundbreaking of the Washington Monument. That's a new one I just learned in preparation for this lecture. So he's very popular. He does everything he says he's going to do, and then he signed out and he left. He did die shortly after, but he left. Now, how he accomplishes this is controversial because for most of it, it's going to require a war. Now, as far as Oregon goes, he basically tells the British at this point, time for you to leave. It's ours now. And there'll be a lot of discussion. There'll be threats of war. In fact, the call sign was 54 or war. But we just agreed on the 49th parallel. You may remember again from previous lecture, we talked about the Transcontinental Treaty and this ordinance with Canada, and we agreed on the 49th parallel to be our border between Louisiana Territory and Canada. We're just going to extend it all the way out to the ocean, and so we're going to get what becomes Idaho, Washington, and Oregon states. They're going to get what becomes Vancouver Territory and all that. So we get grunge music and Starbucks, and I don't know what they got, hockey or something. We get military bases, Navy bases. Again, we don't go to war. It's a very peaceful transition. But as far as Texas goes, which then comes into the United States by treaty, and then the rest of it, which is this area in orange you kind of see on the map, that would be California, what is today Arizona, Nevada, a lot of Utah, a lot of New Mexico. So once Texas became a state, that border dispute between Texas and Mexico now becomes a border dispute between the United States and Mexico. And the United States is far more able to handle it or to do something about it than Texas was. And you can see it's a large area that's under dispute. So what is he going to do? I mean, he knows Texas is coming in. Remember, the ball's already rolling on that. That's a matter of time. So he doesn't really have to do anything. But he knows when he takes over Texas, when Texas enters as a state, we now have this border problem. So he puts a bunch of troops down there, and our view and the Texan view is the Rio Grande is the border. You saw on a previous map, you can kind of see it on this one. Mexico always said it's the Nueces River. Well, we just put a bunch of troops in there, and eventually the troops are going to fight with Mexican troops. People are going to get killed, and then Congress declares war. And so what's the plan? The plan is to secure Texas. So they do that in a matter of weeks. The plan is to secure California. You can see on this map that the U.S. Navy sails all the way around South America, and they end up in Monterey and San Francisco, and John Fremont takes troops, and Kearny takes troops, and they all end up in California. And at the same time, California kind of declares its own independence. That's why they have the bear flag with the republic. And so for a few weeks, kind of technically, they were a republic. And then the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army roll in, and they went, great, we want to be part of the United States. And so that happened. And keep in mind, this whole region that we're looking at is a desert, right? Southern California is a desert. Arizona, New Mexico, the western part of Texas, and the northern part of Mexico are a desert. it's not that difficult for the United States to secure that. And then the third phase is to invade Mexico. And so you can see how Taylor comes in down here in the southern tip of Mexico, or Texas comes in, and you got Winfield Scott coming in and with the Navy and the Marines, and they're going to land, and eventually they're going to invade Mexico, and their goal is to get to Mexico City. Again, you can see how far Mexico City is from Texas. This is why they had so much trouble getting people to move there and taking care of it. And so, long story short, for a year that lasted about 18 or 19 months, a war that lasted 18 or 19 months, there's a lot of really interesting features of this war. One is you have these two great generals. And so, it's kind of already tradition that in America we elect generals to be president. We've done it on several occasions already. Washington and Jackson and Harrison and several other guys were high-level officers. We're going to elect a ton of generals after the Civil War. We're going to elect a couple more. One of those will be Zachary Taylor. So the president kind of messes with them to try to prevent them from getting famous, but they both do anyway. Winfield Scott had already run for president. He'll actually still be alive during the Civil War, and he'll be advising Abraham Lincoln a little bit. But they're going to go and they're going to land and do their thing. And another kind of interesting feature is the number of casualties relative to the number of troops that fought is very high in this war. I think it might be the highest in all of our wars. Not the total number killed, but the percentage of the total that fought. A lot of them, of course, died in the desert and those kind of things, disease. And then maybe more interesting, at least to me, is a lot of the junior officers and medium-level officers in the Mexican-American War are going to be your senior officers when it comes to the Civil War. You can see this is 1846, 1848. The Civil War officially begins in 1861, just 13 years later. So a lot of these guys, they went to West Point together, they fought together here and in other disputes throughout the country, and they know each other. And then when the country splits in half, they know each other. They went to school together. They taught each other. And so a lot of those guys kind of know how the other guys fight. I've been reading General Grant's memoirs, and he starts them when he was in Mexico as a young captain. And he ran across and served with, for, and above a whole bunch of these officers. And so when he gets to the part where the beginning of the Civil War is, he'll write, I knew General so-and-so in Mexico, and I knew him to be this kind of a leader, and yada, yada, yada. So I'm going to approach this battle that way. And he's usually right, and he usually wins because he knows what those guys are doing. It's really interesting how that happened. So the end of this, of course, results in something called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And you can see that dark red line is what Mexico then agrees to. So now they have to agree to the U.S. version of the Texas border, and then they agree to this version of the northern Mexican border, and they cede to us what is California, the whole southwest at this point. And we paid them a bunch of money, $15 million or some such, and kind of went on our way. All right, so that's the war. And so when Pierce is done with his 4 years, the war ended in 1848, his presidency ended in 1849, he had done everything that he said. Here I just wanted to throw this map up there so you can kind of see how the United States has been growing over time. And this helps you to kind of understand this issue of the manifest destiny. We've constantly been growing and moving west. So the red part is the original 13 colonies. That light green part is the settlement we made with England when we won independence. And then the Louisiana Purchase, then Texas, and then you can see Oregon and California. So Jefferson is responsible for adding that middle section, and basically James Polk is responsible for adding these three other sections. You can see one little tiny other section, the Gadsden Purchase, happened in 1853. That has all to do with railroads, trying to go around some mountains, I think is what was going on. But you can see how we've grown and grown and grown and grown. And so the idea that Americans have is like, this is what's supposed to happen. So our next president is Zachary Taylor, the one of the generals who led the conflict here in Mexico. Again, quite popular. Not totally interested in politics, but they kind of made him. He is the last Whig elected president. He's not the last Whig president because he is going to die. And he died suddenly in July, actually like on July 5th or 6th, right after celebrating the 4th of July, eating cherries and milk. He had a stomach problem and he died. And they still don't know exactly why. He was dug up in 1994, I think it was, and they tested him for several poisons and they couldn't find any. I have briefly mentioned the Indian curse. I don't think I've gone into that yet. I'm going to save that for another lecture. But a lot of presidents die because of the Indian curse, and he may be one of them. He is succeeded by a gentleman named Millard Fillmore, who will serve out the rest of that presidency, and that is all I'm going to say about him because it's just not interesting, and it doesn't matter for our purposes. If you want to read about good old Millard Fillmore, be my guest. Now, we do want to talk about the California Gold Rush. We're almost to the end of this particular lecture. The California Gold Rush, I have the date 1849. Technically, it's a little bit wider than that. This is the heyday, the big year. Probably started in 1848 and went on for several years. But 1849 is the big year. And a guy named James Marshall is walking along, and I think you'll see this kind of recreated in one of your videos, but he's walking along and he just literally sees gold nuggets lying in the stream bed and he starts picking them up. And you can't hide something like that. And it doesn't take long before people start hearing that there's gold just laying on the ground in the mountains of California. And pretty soon, over 300,000 people are going to find their way to California. Now, unfortunately for Mexico, this discovery was made right after the session, right after the treaty was signed, like a few weeks after the ink was dry. It's barely dry. And we found gold. And Mexico just does a head slap because there's nothing they can do. And so 300,000 people or more are going to come to California from all over. Of course, many of them from the United States. They're going to come in from Mexico. They're going to come from Asia. They're going to come from Europe, South America. They're going to come from everywhere. It's gold fever, and things are going to get crazy. But with that many people coming in, statehood is inevitable. It's right around the corner. Now, a lot of the people stayed, but not very many got rich, at least not many of the gold miners. Your film, the documentary, is going to tell you that about or less than 1% of the gold miners struck it rich. Most just went up there into the mountains and they panned for gold or sluiced for gold. There's a lot of different methods. Very few found enough to get rich. Many found enough to kind of get by on. But imagine the scenario. You're up there in the mountains and you're looking for gold and you're fighting with the elements. And if you've ever spent any time in the high Sierras or the high Rockies, you should, number one, because it's gorgeous and fun and beautiful, but it's also very dangerous. The weather can change in a heartbeat. I've almost been killed up there a couple times on backpacking trips and things. Of course, there are bears and all kinds of wild animals. There are native people up there, and sometimes the miners fall awry of them. But, you get hurt up there, you're on your own. But a lot of these guys would find enough gold to kind of get by, right? They would be up there for 6 months. They would realize winter's coming, and so they would go back down to Sacramento. Maybe they'd go all the way to San Francisco. They would exchange the gold ore, the nuggets, the flakes they had been finding for all these months, and that would get weighed and chemically processed into an amount of money by Wells Fargo or some other broker. Then they would get paid cash or they would have credit. And then they would go on a binger, right? These guys have been up in the mountains for 6 months. They would go get drunk and do all this crazy stuff, and they would spend a lot of their money. Then they would realize, hey, I got to survive on that. And so they would do odd jobs of this, that, and the other. And they would basically burn through all their money before they were ready to go back. So then maybe they're in debt. They have creditors. They go back to mine some more the next year. And they just kind of get stuck in this process. So if they don't get killed up there, they just kind of keep doing it. A lot of them will go into other businesses. They'll retire, or some will leave. Many people stay because California, by and large, is a very nice climate. And of course, it will have a very, very poor negative impact on the natives. Mostly disease. That old problem keeps cropping up. The geography in California is such that a lot of the natives were, fairly isolated. They were small tribes, fairly isolated from everyone, and these miners go up there and they got a lot of them sick and a lot of them died. Of course, there was fighting and different things like that going on too. Now, one of the big benefits of the gold rush is, a few people got rich, and yes, a whole bunch of people moved west, but it brought huge amounts of money into the money supply. Remember, we had the Panic of 1837 where a bunch of banks closed down and businesses closed down. We more or less recovered from that, but then we had a war, and war is expensive. Well, now all this gold is being funneled into the economy, and we're talking, in today's money, billions and billions of dollars worth of gold. And it was just flowing in back into the economy, back into the banks. Of course, you have all these people moving west. Not all of the people that initially went west went to California. They stayed in Colorado, or a lot of people went to Oregon, different places. And that helped people later come along as they started building these towns and these markets. So this gold is going to filter back through and really invigorate the American economy. And so here's just a graphic of the Oregon Trail, which is the way a lot of people went to California. So the Oregon Trail goes back to the 1820s, really, maybe sooner. And you can see the California Trail, which was a cutoff there through the Donner Pass. One of your films talks about the Donner Party. They got stuck and they were reduced to cannibalism. I found it funny, if you haven't seen it yet, or I don't remember which video it's in, but they talk about how they would label the people, the dead bodies, so that you wouldn't have to eat your family. I'm kind of thinking I would probably want to eat my family because I know where they've been. I don't know if I want to eat some other guy that's been on the trail with us. But anyway, it was a crazy, horrible time. There were a number of survivors, and I don't think you ever really recover from that. But in any case, hundreds of thousands of people are going to make their way through the Oregon Trail and going west. And you can see all these forts. That's because the military has to follow them to help protect them. And then each of these forts, people are going to build communities around these forts. That's why a lot of our cities are named Fort something or other in this country. And so I think this takes us to probably the last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture, which is the Compromise of 1850. And it has to do with California entering as the 31st state. And you may recall from previous lecture that we have this issue in Congress, in the Senate particularly, of balance. There are, at this point, 15 slave states and 15 free states, with the green unorganized territory and the Oregon Territory looking like they're going to be free areas, and Minnesota. Remember that Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, drew this line you can see right above Texas and the Indian Territory. And so the only area left is that Indian Territory, but it's full of all these Indians that were moved in there. So this is creating a real problem. And as I've said a couple of times before, the slave states are already paranoid about losing slavery because there's a growing voice in the North about doing away with it. And other countries have already done away with it, like England and so on. And so they know it's going to go away. And they have created in the Missouri Compromise a situation where there's not room for a lot of new states. So adding all this territory actually kind of opens that whole can of worms again. And you can see there's these two new territories, New Mexico and Utah Territory. And so a big question is raised. What are we going to do with those territories? Are we going to allow slavery in those territories? And that's a huge question that everybody's fighting over. So California, of course, is going to come in as a free state, and they're voted down at first. Congress, neither side will allow California to come in because it's going to be a free state and it's going to unbalance things all the way. But California is too wealthy and too valuable, and there's too many people. And so they have to. And so Henry Clay, now in his 70s, proposes a compromise, and it's known as the Compromise of 1850. And basically what he suggests is we have to bring California in. And so in order to do that, we have to dangle kind of a carrot out there for the slave states so that they'll be willing to vote yes and allow California in, even though it's going to unbalance things a little. And one of the carrots is we're going to take Texas and restructure it. And you can see now Texas has the shape that we're used to, the shape that Texas, the state, is. And that'll happen around 1850 as a piece of this compromise. So they chop a big chunk of it off and they put it in partly in New Mexico territory and partly in this unorganized territory. They also handle some of Texas pre-war debts and things like that. So that's part of it. And then the really big carrot is that they're going to rewrite the Fugitive Slave Act, which was written in 1793. And it was written at a time when there was an assumption that slavery was going to sort of peter out. But then the cotton boom happened, remember, and changed everything. But the law in 1793 made it pretty difficult to recover a runaway slave. Think about it. There's no fingerprints, there's no pictures, there's no DNA testing, there's no way to totally prove that some person had been one of your slaves. And so unless they had some really unique feature and you could prove this in a kind of a court, then you wouldn't get them back. So if you were a runaway slave and you got to the Green Territory, you were pretty much home free. Well, they're going to rewrite it in 1850, and it's going to be a joke. It's going to do a 180 and make it so stupidly easy to say that some person is your slave that people are going to start getting kidnapped. They'll highlight that, and I think the film called Division that you need to watch right at the beginning, people are getting kidnapped. People who were never slaves are going to get kidnapped and brought to the South and enslaved. You might have heard of the film or read the book 12 Years a Slave, which is about Solomon Northup, which this kind of thing happened to him. And lots of black Americans are going to be kidnapped and sold into slavery, even though they never were, because of this law. Now, on the other hand, people are going to start seeing how this law gets abused, and people are going to start, especially in the North, are going to start going, wait a second, this is bad. We know that guy wasn't a slave. And they're starting to really start to grab hold of these abuses. And so the 1850s, like I said in the lecture we did on reform movements, is really when the anti-slave movement really gets off the ground and starts moving. So that's it for this lecture. The next one's called If You Can't Join 'Em, Beat 'Em. And I have a little cartoon of the Brooks, Preston Brooks beating up Charles Sumner in the building, in the Capitol building, because of an argument they were having. That's how bad things are going to get between North and South, or Democrat and this new Republican Party, which probably doesn't surprise you because it's almost how things are right now. In any case, come back later and you'll watch rather, If You Can't Join 'Em, Beat 'Em.